when I was asked if I wanted to give a presentation in the series this year, of course I said yes. And I had to give a topic 6 or 7 months ago. And I decided that I'm surely would be able to say something about delivery and the sharing economy, which is a topic that has interested me for a while. When I actually started preparing the talk, I decided to do a bit of a combination of my perspective of the developments I see in this area, and focus also a little bit, but not very much, on some of the work that has been done here at Georgia Tech in this context. So it's a mixture. It's a bit of a perspective view, introduction maybe to some of the questions that I think are relevant and important, and a tiny bit also reflecting on work that we've done here with some of the companies that are actively involved in these questions. So what I want to do is first talk a little bit about last mile delivery. I mentioned delivery in the title, but I'm really thinking about last mile delivery here. Then I want to introduce the concept of sharing and gig economy. And then I want to focus a bit more on meal delivery specifically, where both of these are coming together. And it's also a very popular and interesting topic, and that's an area that we at Georgia Tech have worked on extensively, I have to say. But as I said, I want to start by just looking a bit at last mile delivery, which was also the starting point for us, I think, here at Tech, in terms of what we wanted to work on or have been working on. And surprisingly, things have changed a bit around. I'm not exactly sure why. In the presentation I had, that one was in the upper left-hand corner. And it clearly shows that we're talking about Amazon here, although most of you may have recognized this a little bit. But so why a slide on Amazon? I think Amazon certainly has been partly responsible for sort of the attention that last mile delivery has been getting. And so I wanted to point out a few numbers. The number that's now in the middle, about 150 million mobile users accessed the app in September. So there are a few things I wanted to point out. Of course, that it's a large number, but also that this was purely only app access, right? Not on your home computer or your laptop. It was through a mobile phone, right? So, and we'll get back to that later. The other thing that I think is very important to realize is the number of products that is listed in the upper right-hand corner, right? I remember very well, because I'm among the older ones here in the room, that Amazon started selling books, right? Now their portfolio is 119 or about 120 million different products that you can buy online. Right, so that's a phenomenal change. Also, at your lower left-hand corner, Amazon Prime Day, which is their big marketing employ to get you to buy things and you get discounts, they sold 100 million products. Right. So one of the things that interest academics or people like me is that Amazon has really changed the scale of the business, right? It's also listed here. We have 4,000 items sold per minute, right? That leads to huge changes in how you can think about optimization technology to support operations like this, which makes it very interesting to all of us. There are a few more statistics. One of them is Prime, Amazon Prime. I expect that at least some of us in the room are Amazon Prime members. I'm one. What I wanted to point out mostly is the slide or the information on the right. If you look at what do Prime members like about the service, right? And it captures two important pieces of information about last mile delivery, right? They like that it's free, and they like that it's going to be at their home fairly fast, within 2 days. Right. And this seems to characterize what's happening, at least on the customer side, in last mile delivery. People don't want to pay too much for it, preferably free, and they want to have things as fast as possible. Right? And this is where a logistics person starts to get kind of itchy, because that makes things challenging. That seems to work, right, is shown here with a fairly recent clip from something that appeared in The Guardian, a newspaper that I tend to read. I think this was last week, or at least not long ago. Profits have gone up tremendously as a result, at least that's what Amazon thinks, by offering next day service instead of 2-day service, right? And they plan to roll this out, hopefully, to all of us, right? So again, Amazon is investing heavily in making delivery faster and faster and faster, right? Now, anybody in the logistics fields that knows that that also means your chances for consolidation will go down. If you have less time, of course, they make it up by volume, right? So there's some interesting trade-offs happening here. So let's look a bit at growth in last mile delivery, right? What's happening here? And clearly, the big reason is e-commerce, right? So business to consumer, we can purchase almost anything we want now online and get it delivered to our home. Right? So the bullet underneath about product availability is very important here as well, right? The growth is sort of two parts. It's more products you can buy online, and people tend to buy more online. Growth of the middle class, that's maybe not necessarily the case in the US, but certainly in other parts of the world, China specifically, more people can afford to buy things, and they tend to buy it online. The other part, I mentioned that already, the smartphones, right? We saw, 150 million people sort of actually purchased something online through their mobile phone. Right, the technology has played a big role in this. We all know, I saw some statistics that we look at least 25 times a day, if it wasn't per hour, on our phone, right? And then the other part, and we'll get to that later, is of course it's not only Amazon that is sort of heavily involved in the online business. We've also have really different business models. And in part, that was motivated by the sharing economy, which we'll get to do a bit later. So there's all this growth. I want to highlight a few things about e-commerce per se, and I'm sure most people have seen statistics like this. What to me is the most interesting is the graph on the right, and especially the blue line. Right? The blue line indicates the fraction of retail sales that is going to be purchased online. Right? Now, this is for China, and China is much further ahead of us in that curve. But they expect that more than half, more than 60%, is going to be purchased online. Right? And that's an interesting statistic. The growth in China, again, just a figure about packages. The growth is enormous. Just look at the red bars. They keep going up almost exponentially, right? So this is big business. Of course, that comes at a price, right? And I do think we, especially as a community, logistics community, and everybody is aware of this, but need to really think about it and also think about what we can and should be doing, right? There's also negative consequences of this enormous growth. right? The most obvious one is traffic and congestion, right? Especially in urban areas. Second lane parking, right? There's no space for the delivery vehicles to park, so they still have to make their deliveries. They cannot just drive around waiting for a parking spot, and we get situations like we see in the picture. Obviously, there is a big question about emissions, right? Climate change, things, we need to be mindful of this. If more and more is going to be delivered at home, we need to start thinking about how to mitigate the effects. And I'll show you some ideas of how that's going to work. I want to mention two trends. The one I mentioned already is that the trend is that everything needs to be delivered faster, faster, and faster, right? The statistics up there are for the US. It mentions instant delivery. And instant delivery is especially relevant when we go to meal delivery. The idea of instant delivery is that once you place an order, the fulfillment essentially starts right away. It's instant. It doesn't mean that you have it instantly, but at least the process starts. So anything where, let's say, your service guarantee is within an hour, within 2 hours after placing the order, is now considered under the category instant delivery, if you were not familiar with that. And I mentioned already that Amazon wants to get things to us faster and faster. The other trend that is important also when it comes to mitigation of the negative externalities of last mile delivery is there's new technology. And here there's really a mixture of why people are thinking about these technologies. One, from the company's perspective, is cost and service. And part of it is also, as I said, mitigation. Especially electric vehicles is a combination, right? It's better for the environment, and that's an important part of why a lot of people are thinking about it. Self-driving vehicles, the situation is a bit different. There, the hope is that it's really cost reduction. You don't need to necessarily, and we'll see a few examples, have delivery people on board or drivers on board, so that saves you cost. I'll give you a few examples in case you're not that familiar with Droids. Here are some pictures, right? This is what we're thinking about. They can go on sidewalks, make small deliveries. Amazon is testing them. It's one of the new technologies that's out there. I haven't seen them in my street yet, but they may be coming soon. Self-driving delivery vans, I find this interesting. In this particular picture, it's not necessarily completely clear how things are going to work, right? Is there still a person that is going to take the packages out of the van and deliver them to me? Here, we see that they're tests in terms of grocery deliveries. I find this one the most intriguing and the most likely to be effective, right? This is kind of a parcel box on wheels, right? As you can see from the design, you can walk up to this vehicle, type in your code, and one of the lockers is going to open. Right? So if you think about why are companies thinking about this, well, there's several reasons, right? One is this is an autonomous vehicle, so there's no driver, so that saves on cost. The other thing that's interesting, parcel boxes take up space, right? And space is not always available. Right? Stores take up space. Here you have a mobile solution where all you need is a place where you can park for a little bit and then move on. So this is kind of a very interesting concept, and we'll get back later that there are people that believe that this is what we're going to see more and more of and the dominant mode of delivering parcels. Right? The other thing that it does is it doesn't go to your home, right? So it still has a consolidation opportunity, right? So it's kind of mitigating possibly emissions, time, and also still making it convenient. We could have this come to the parking lot of the ISYE building, which currently doesn't exist, and we could go and pick up our packages there, right? Which is a good mode of transport. Electric vehicles, I think here the main motivation is climate change, right? Electric is better than diesel or whatever, and I think this is going to be big, and it's also a very good thing for society to see that companies like Amazon are going to use these more and more, right? And like anything, if Amazon orders something, they're going to order a few. Here are some other examples of the electric vehicles. The one thing to note here is that the Amazon one is still pretty large. That's more for possibly home deliveries. In really downtown areas, you want to have smaller versions that may be able, if it's legal, to go on the sidewalk, etc. So there's a lot of different designs that are happening right now. Of course, in inner city, especially in Europe, where vehicles may not always be allowed to go into the city center at certain times, bike couriers are in many ways ideal, right? It's efficient, there's no emissions, you can have a combination of pure bicycle or electric bicycle. It's a very nice option. The last thing I want to point out is this is, I think, another example of where things are going, right? So here the idea, what we're looking at, is there is kind of a parcel box where you can go to pick up your package, but this is going to be supplied fully in a fully automated way, right? So a drone can come, and then there is technology inside that can just handle, and so everything can be done without human interference, other than picking up your package, right? So one thing that this shows that there are a lot of creative people out there that are trying to make last mile delivery both easier, cleaner, and more efficient, right? There's a lot of things happening, which is why this is an exciting time. I wanted to show you something that was published in a recent study by McKinsey about different mechanisms for parcel delivery, and I'll flip through them quickly. So the first one that you see there is the traditional one. You have a person driving around in a vehicle, stops at the front of your door, and hands you the package, right? Drones, we've all seen the little videos of Amazon. The other one, and we'll get to that in a minute, is crowd shipping, right? So it's not the Amazon employee that's going to make the delivery, but somehow there is an app, and when you say, I need a delivery, somebody, an individual like you and me, is going to make the delivery. And we'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. Then we have the droids that we've seen, bike couriers, semi-autonomous ground vehicles, and the ones that I pointed out, right, kind of the mobile parcel boxes, which also this study believes is going to be the future, right? Autonomous vehicle, like a parcel box, that can get to strategically chosen locations, and you can go there and pick up your package, right? That's what they believe is going to be the big future. All right, so where does the sharing and gig economy come in, right? So let's first make sure that we put the concepts there so that we know what we're talking about. So if we look at the sharing economy, right, as the name suggests, we're sharing assets among individuals mostly, right? That's the big idea. The gig economy is more that you are no longer an employee, but you work on gigs, right? So you, for a short period of time, you perform a task, and that is a gig, and you get paid for that, right? So that's, so, and clearly if we think about a company like Uber, this is where these two are coming together, right? Many of the drivers that work for Uber use their own vehicle, and so in that sense, they're sharing an asset. And some of them at least are performing gigs, right? If you only work for an hour, it's considered a gig. I mean, we've seen, and this is a downside of this trend, that there are lots of people that actually work for 8 hours. So de facto, they have become an employee, but they're not treated as an employee and don't get the benefits that employees get. And this is, of course, where we've seen, or at least some of us, in California, they're trying to change that, right? The AB5 legislation says, if you work for 8 hours for Uber, Uber should consider you to be an employee, right? And we'll have to see what happens with that because they're going to fight it in court, right? Something interesting, gig economy seems to be growing rapidly. I grabbed some statistics here, right, that we may find that in the near future, most of us are working in the gig economy rather than as an employee of a company or the state like I am. All right, so as I mentioned, when we put sharing and gig economy together, we're getting kind of the Uber-like activities. And if we sort of put that together again with last mile delivery, then the prime example of that is meal delivery, right? Another important one is groceries that share similar characteristics, although the pickup is typically in grocery stores or your Walmart rather than a restaurant, but it shares similar features. Right. And I want to specifically look at this a little bit because we have spent quite some time with one of the players in this area. So this is not a US phenomenon, right? We see it happening everywhere. I had a chance to talk with people from Meituan not so long ago, and which is the Chinese version of meal delivery. And if I have time, I'll come back to that particular example a tiny bit later. Here are some statistics for the US. Basically, it shows that it's growing. The other part that is important is, and I don't know if you can easily read that, platform to consumer delivery, which is the blue part. And that is kind of the GrubHub, the Uber Eats, etc., that we're going to focus on, right? Of course, pizza delivery, we've known that for ages. What's new in a way are these aggregators that are really taking over this business. If we think about market sizes, not surprisingly, China is the biggest market for meal delivery. Of course, they have a huge population. There is big adoption of technology. It's big, but the US is not that far behind, certainly in terms of money. All right, so here are a few players in the US, and I'm going to focus on GrubHub, which is one of the large players in this arena. So we probably all have heard of GrubHub. Certainly the students here in the audience may have even used it. One of the things I want to point out here is that and I checked their website yesterday if this number was still accurate, they're making 500,000 deliveries per day. And if you think about this, clearly that process can no longer be manual. Right? When I started working with GrubHub 4 or 5 years ago, it was still manual, right? And it's amazing how quickly, and of course they realize that that's not maintainable if they continue to grow, right? So you need technology, and that's partly what I'm going to talk about. So, of course, we know how it works. We have an app. We look at what we want to eat. We press a button, and it gets delivered where we are. And if you think about it, of course, this is one of these examples where you want instant delivery, right? If you are hungry and you want to eat, you don't want to wait 3 hours, right? So, this is the prime example of an environment where the service guarantee has to be short and has to be instant, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the OR side of things, and there are basically three takeaways. One is that what happens in most of these situations now, it's kind of repeatedly solving an assignment problem. And we'll get into a little bit of detail in a minute. The other one, which I think personally is the most intriguing, is driver capacity management. Right? If you think about what is the big change in the sharing economy and the use of crowd shipping, it's that where in the past companies owned the delivery capacity, like UPS owns the delivery capacity, you had private fleets, etc. That's all changing. Right? With the sharing economy, you now have tons of people that are not your employee, and you want to rely on them to make deliveries. Like GrubHub doesn't employ any drivers, right? They're all individuals that use an app like Uber to say, hey, I'm happy to drive and deliver for you in the next hour, right? How do you manage that capacity? Remember that in meal delivery, you want to be sure that the meal is delivered, let's say, within 45 minutes. How do you ensure that you have the delivery capacity to make that happen, right? This is a completely new kind of question that we didn't see 10 years ago, and a very challenging one. And we'll talk more about that in the future. The other thing that I have observed, and I'll spend a few minutes talking about that, naturally, when GrubHub started, the focus was on what they call the diner, the customer that orders the meal, right? All their focus was on how can we make that customer, that diner happy, right? How should we build our optimization or decision technology to make the diners happy, right? What we see now is that there is a big change happening, that they realize that they also need to make their drivers happy, in part because they're not their employees. Right? And unhappy drivers may, instead of accepting tasks for GrubHub, may actually say, I prefer to work for Uber or Uber Eats. And so this is a big change, and there are lots of interesting opportunities for people that like to think about logistics, transportation, and optimization to see how to go about that, or pricing, etc. But we'll get back to that. There's a lot of words here, but we all understand the basic principle. You place an order, and that gets somehow delivered to your home. The bottom part is probably the most interesting part, that says that there is an awful lot of uncertainty in this whole process. Right? How many orders are placed? Because it all happens on the app. It's not like I place an order and say, well, can you tomorrow evening at 6:30 deliver a pizza? Right? It's not how it works. It's instant delivery that matters. There is some prediction that can happen, and we'll get to that in the end when we start talking a bit more about machine learning. Similarly, meal preparation time, right, is uncertain. Right? These aggregators talk with the restaurant, have some agreement on sort of what they can expect, but many of the restaurants have also seating and people in the restaurant, and they often prefer to keep them happy, so there's a lot of uncertainty even in when the meal is ready. Right. And then there is traffic and all those other things. Parking, are you in an apartment complex? There's a lot of uncertainty in this particular environment. So how do these companies, the ones that we're aware of, Uber Eats and GrubHub, actually solve this problem? Well, the core is repeated assignment, and we'll get to that in a minute. So what are the main entities or elements in this process, right? On the one hand, you have the orders, and on the other hand, you have the drivers, right? And so an order also has a restaurant associated with it. So this is where the pickup takes place. And of course, an order also has a delivery address. And a driver, even though I didn't put it here, in some cases you know a little bit about how long they're working, and we'll get to that in a minute. If they're purely signing on, then you may not know how long they will be there for you, but in the GrubHub case, many of them have a fixed period of time when they work. And then what I didn't list here is you know what their current list of tasks is that have already been assigned to them and where they are or where they become available again, right? And then there is, okay, so we need to put these together. Right? And if you think about optimizing these decisions, then you need to have an objective. And so it's actually already quite important to think about what the objectives are. Right? And the two that we have been using most are click-to-door time, which means I push the button, when is the meal actually arriving at my door? And there is also ready-to-door, which is when was the meal ready at the restaurant and did it arrive at home, right? And clearly the first one is my total weight and the second one is freshness, right? And so both are important. But of course they're also drivers, right? Because that's your cost in the system. So you want to utilize them as best as you can. So somehow there are all these different objectives that you have that you need to put together in an optimization-based approach. And I wanted to look a little bit more at these two basic performance metrics, at least the way that GrubHub thinks about them, right? So when you place an order, internally they have a target. Let's say within 45 minutes, we want that order to be placed. And if you think about this, this already is kind of, it's not a strange concept, but it is already something where you could have questions whether this is the right way to go, right? Because clearly, if you live next door to the restaurant, it's going to be easier for me to make the delivery than if you live far away from the restaurant. So should the target be the same? But even if you think about the target, right, should it be a function of the placement time, right? So should the target be different at 3 p.m. versus 6 p.m.? We know that the order volumes at 6 p.m. are going to be quite different, right? Should it be different based on the particular restaurant, right? Some restaurants tend to be busier than others. Should we take that into account when we use our internal target? Right? And time of day, day of the week, all these things already, in a way you need to think about them. At GrubHub, it's usually just 45 minutes, right? But there are lots of questions about that. And similarly, you can think about ready-to-door time. What in the optimization, the way they think about it is if you sort of exceed the target time, then somehow something that's not good is happening and you want to avoid that, right? So this is how the optimization deals with these kind of questions. So what are the challenges? There's a lot of uncertainty in this system, right? So basically what you do is you have a mostly reactive approach, right? At a certain point in time, you look at what you know and do the best you can, right? So here is that process, right? Here is, we sketch how it works. So at some point your day starts and at some point your day ends, meaning the time that you accept your last orders. And then during that day, every few minutes, you make decisions. Right? And at GrubHub, this happens every minute. Right? But there are already interesting questions. Is a minute really important? Could it be 2 minutes? Right? Then we maybe can batch more, and there are lots of questions there. And each time you solve an assignment model, And then you have to commit, and I'll be more specific about what that means. Right, so for those of you that have seen OR models, right, we have the drivers on one side, and what they do is they look at all drivers that are active at that time, right? So for all drivers, you can look at what time and what location do they finish their last assigned task. Right, so that's the time that matters. And then the other thing is you have orders. And you have choices to make already there. Do you look at individual orders, or do you already group, let's say, orders that are close to each other into a single kind of unit which you want to assign to the driver? Right? And then the biggest challenge is, how do you actually put a weight or sort of a measure of how good is this particular assignment? Right, that's where, in a way, all the knowledge and proprietary information should go. Right, every company, Uber Eats, uses these kind of methods, and they think they do better because of how they choose kind of this evaluation about what are good measures to use. That it's not easy, I tried to illustrate with a few small examples, right? So let's look at the particular order, which is the blue circle, and this is the time when it gets ready at the restaurant. Note that this is already uncertain, but in these optimization models, it's assumed that we know this. And you have two drivers, one that's a little bit further away, but is ready with his last task or completes his last task a bit earlier, so it can drive a longer distance and get there before the order is ready. Or you have a driver that is much closer, but only finishes a little bit later, and therefore he can get to the restaurant only a little bit after the order is ready. Right? Now, which one should you prefer? Right? It's not completely obvious, right? In a way, maybe the driver that is nearby, because when he drives to the restaurant, he's driving empty and not doing something useful, would be preferable. But if you think about the customer, maybe picking up the order when it's ready may be preferable, right? So there are a lot of trade-offs that have to be made. I mentioned commitment strategies earlier. The reason for talking about commitment is, as I said, you look at all the drivers and all the orders that are in the system, and you make the best possible assignments. That doesn't necessarily mean that those assignments have to be implemented. Right? There is sort of a second step where you look at all the assignments and say, should I implement this assignment or not? And the simplest case, in a way, is if I made an assignment to a driver that is still actively working on a task, and it takes 3 minutes at least for that driver to finish the task, and I'm going to run my optimization again in 2 minutes, maybe I don't need to commit, right? Because I have another chance to see if more information is available and I can make a better assignment for that driver, right? So some assignments we simply ignore. Then there are also assignments that you say, okay, you have to start driving now to pick up that order. There's just nothing we should do. Otherwise, it's going to be very late. You can also make decisions, well, start driving towards the restaurant, but when you get to the restaurant, we may actually either change or augment the assignment that we gave you earlier, right? So in the commitment part, there are also a number of different issues that come up. Another important aspect is bundling, right? I already mentioned that maybe sometimes you want to group orders or bundle orders and assign a bundle to a driver. Right. And again, if you think about this, the trade-offs are not obvious, right? Bundling can be more effective in the sense that going, deliver, come back to the restaurant, and then deliver again, of course, involves partly empty driving, takes up more time. So it might be better to pick up 2 orders at the same time, then go deliver one and deliver the other. Right? It's a more efficient use of your driver capacity. On the other hand, as this example shows, is that if we have 3 orders that we want to put together in a bundle, of course I can only pick up the bundle when the last order is ready. Right? So order number 3 determines when I can pick up this bundle. But that means that order 1, which was already ready earlier, is losing freshness, right? And then there's also the sequencing of how I'm going to deliver them, right? If on top of that I'm first doing 3, then 2, then 1, then that order is also in the vehicle longer, right? So even though bundling is necessary at some times during the day, how to do it is not necessarily an obvious question. So here are another aspect that we looked at with GrubHub is this is some curves that show what happens during a day, right? So as you expect, there is a little bit of activity during the lunch hour, and the big activity happens during the dinner hour. Right? Now, what's interesting, or the most interesting thing, is the green line. The green line shows how many drivers become available, so finish a task, or their last assigned task, in the next 15 minutes, right? So you can just do a plot and create such a graph. And then the other is, of course, you can also plot how many orders sort of were placed at a particular time, which is the blue curve, at least to think about this, right? And so if you look at the green graph and the blue graph, you see that there is some challenges happening at dinner time, right? The number of drivers that becomes available in the next 15 minutes is relatively small compared to the number of orders. So you have to start bundling if you want to have any chance of success. Right? So one of the kind of things we worked on is trying to design a metric that helps recognize when it's time to start bundling more aggressively. Here is how bundling works. We've seen this graph. I mentioned this already. In a way, if you look at it, at lunchtime on this particular day, they had too many drivers. They didn't need that many. But at dinner time, they had too few. Right? And this already points to this capacity management question that I believe is so important. You can look at some other things. I mean, when drivers, one thing that you see here is that you had a large number of drivers during the lunch period. You had an even larger number of drivers during the dinner period and fewer in between. But the work that they do, especially the one, so a lot of them came on duty at 5, right? But they spent a lot of time driving to the first restaurant, right? This is the green area. And that's not very effective. You're not using them effective. So can you do something about that when you think about driver management? All right. There's a lot more things that you can do. I'm going to skip that. I do want to point out a few of the practical complications. You may actually lose communication with your drivers, right? It's one thing to say, I optimize every minute, and I'm going to commit. And then you say, well, there is this job that you can do, or this task that you can do. First of all, tell me whether you're going to accept this, right? They're not your employees, so they may actually say no. And they say actually no very often, which is frustrating, of course, for a company like GrubHub. I was surprised when I heard that that's in the order of 35 to 40%. Right? Imagine how to deal with this. Right? That's challenging. And I mean, of course, uncertainty, etc., etc., etc. All right. So as I said, and this is one of the things I want you to take away, right? From an academic perspective, this is, I think, where most of our opportunities are to do really something innovative, right? How do you manage this uncertain capacity, right? This is totally new. We didn't have, UPS doesn't worry about it. Amazon worries about it a little bit. but certainly companies like GrubHub and Uber Eats, this is a big thing. And we're currently also working together with Roadie, which is sort of a local startup that actually is doing home grocery delivery for Walmart, relying again on crowd shipping, crowdsourcing. How do you manage to make sure that you can deliver in an hour or 2 hours? How do you know you have enough drivers, right? So how to ensure that the sufficient number of drivers is available to deliver the placed orders and to meet the service promise, right? The latter part is very important. If you promise delivery within an hour or within 45 minutes, how can you make sure that you have the right number of people? So I split this up in two questions. One is, how do you even know how many you need, right? I mean, it's one thing to start thinking about maybe how should I reward them, but the first thing is, how many do I actually need, right? And that's not an easy question, right? Because it depends on your dispatching strategy, it depends on the order patterns, it depends on the geography of the city in which you operate. These questions are not easy to answer, right? And with Roadie and a PhD student here, we're working on using machine learning techniques to try and estimate how many drivers we need for a particular store at particular times of day, or for particular order patterns. And then the other question is, even if you know how many drivers you should have, how can you make sure you get them, right? And so the latter question we looked at a little bit also with GrubHub, because of course the only way that you can control them somewhat is by means of compensation, right? And so in the GrubHub case, which is a reasonable approach, is they say we're going to actually request that you commit to working for us for a certain period of the day, let's say between 5 and 7 tomorrow. And in return for that commitment, we give you a guaranteed minimum pay, right? And hopefully that attracts enough people to sign up, right? Otherwise, you're completely dependent on what orders I assign to you. But here, at least, you have a minimum pay guarantee. On top of that, we may also ask that you can only per hour reject one of our tasks that we offer you, right? So you can structure this compensation in different ways, right? But what that means now is if you start planning such a system, there are two different types of drivers in your system. One, the ones that we label scheduled, right, which have accepted this minimum pay guarantee and in return tell me or are available for me to assign. But you also still have the people that just open the app and say, I'm here, if you have a task for me, I'm going to do it. Right? So we looked a little bit at developing technology to determine how many scheduled drivers you would need, right? So what these blocks would look like. How many scheduled drivers are needed and what should their blocks look like, right? So we developed some technology for that, and if you think about it, so that's a tactical planning problem that we solved the night before. And of course, during the day, there is dispatching, dynamic routing, and you have these unscheduled drivers that also show up. Right? So this is quite a difficult problem, and you want to maintain some service guarantee. Right? 95% of the orders are delivered at or before the target. Right? That's kind of how we incorporate that. We use continuous approximation, value function approximation. If people are interested in more detail, we can talk about that a little bit later. We tried it on meal delivery data from Iowa that's publicly available for different strategies, and our strategy seems to work in the sense that we can make drivers available at the right time for the right amount of time, better than other strategies, which saves you on cost for the company. So as I mentioned, the third thing that I wanted to talk briefly about is the fact that now suddenly companies are starting to worry more and more about the drivers as opposed to only the diners. One situation that we encountered early on in our work with GrubHub was what we labeled driver drainage. Right? And what that means is drivers are not stupid people. Right? Over time, they get a sense of where am I going to be making the most money. Right? Should I be in Buckhead or should I be in Alpharetta? Should I be downtown? Should I be in Virginia Highlands? They somehow start recognizing that if they were in a particular area, either the tips were higher, or they got more orders per hour, or the distance between the restaurant and the delivery address was shorter, which is good for them. So drivers start to converge all on areas where they believe they're going to make more money. Of course, it doesn't work like that because you have too many drivers there, then you can't assign. But for the company, the biggest worry is now you have areas where people place orders and I don't have any drivers. Right? That's the worst part. So how do you deal with such situation? Right? So one opportunity that you can consider is actually restricting drivers to particular regions. Right? So we only assign you orders from this particular area. Right? On the other hand, we can also see that that can be limiting. Right? If you don't need that many drivers in that particular area for half an hour or an hour in the day, how did you start thinking about sharing? Right? So should there be sharing of these kind of ideas? The other thing that you notice is drivers tend to like operating in one and the same area. They familiarize themselves with the delivery addresses, where they can park, etc. So, and especially if they live in that area, they don't want to wander around all of New York City, for example, right? They'd rather work in only the Bronx or whatever. So how do you start incorporating these ideas in your decision technology is a big thing that the companies are now thinking about. And then, as I mentioned before, you've probably seen it, especially in the Uber-Lyft situation. These drivers work for multiple platforms at the same time, right? So how do you create loyalty? How do you make that happen? That's not an easy thing. Another thing that we have been thinking about, not really developing technology that GrubHub decided to use, but the other thing that is quite interesting and intriguing again to me is that you control what's shown on the app, right? If, let's take a simple example. If a customer wants to order a pizza, I decide which pizza restaurants that person sees on the first page on the screen. Right? Now, clearly, probably you pick restaurants that are not too far away from his delivery address, because that's one, what he expects, or she, but also probably what works best for you. But if you happen to have a driver already at a particular pizza restaurant, maybe that one should be at the top of the list, right? A pizza is a pizza, at least to me, right? So how do you manage which of the restaurants you display? Now, of course, your contracts are with the restaurants, and so you don't have complete flexibility, but you have some flexibility. And there are interesting questions on how do you manage orders to minimize your logistics cost while still satisfying the service promises that you make? They're very interesting questions that students here that's still looking for interesting topics to work on, certainly this is one of them. So I mentioned research opportunities in this space. There are plenty around capacity management, order management, and there's still lots of more things that we can do, even in the driver order assignment. How can you look ahead? How can you incorporate predictions about where sort of the next batch of orders is going to come from? This also indicates that there are great opportunities potentially for machine learning, right? All of us in the room, I'm sure, have heard the buzz around machine learning and that it's going to solve all our problems. Once you can once you can win at Go, you can probably solve any problem in the world, right? Of course, it's not that simple, but there are certain types of things that could be very helpful here, right? Predicting future orders is not easy, and the standard forecasting techniques may not be appropriate, right? Because what you really need to know, or maybe want to know, need is a big statement, but want to know is delivery location specific, right? So there's not that much samples from a particular location that allow forecasting to work with great accuracy. And there are lots of things that influence this. The time of day, the weather of the day, I mean traffic conditions. So it's possible that machine learning can do better than the traditional forecasting techniques. Order acceptance is a very interesting one. We tried to do some basic regression modeling with GrubHub to see what influences that decision, right? We thought maybe if a driver is at the end of his or her shift, he wants to make sure that he ends near his home. Is that important? It's the tip, and we had a whole range of features. It turned out that the best predictor was if he had actually often rejected orders before. Still useful information, maybe, but that was a very basic, simple model. Maybe there's more that we can do. So I think there are certainly opportunities for machine learning. What is the right time to start trying somehow to get more drivers in the system? Right? As we said, we in our decision technology developed at least one metric that we use to be more aggressive in bundling, but maybe something similar is needed to try and attract more drivers, right? Search pricing or whatever it is, right? And again, machine learning might be helping you to make decisions like that. All right, I wanted to end. I mentioned that I had a chance to talk with people from Meituan when I was in Beijing in December. And they're one of the biggest meal delivery platforms that exist. And also remember that I mentioned that GrubHub now delivers 500,000 orders per day. As you can imagine, in China, things are always a bit larger. Right? So here are the numbers that you have. So they actually have 27 million orders per day that they need to deal with. Thousands, hundreds of thousands per minute that come into their system, right? And typically they have 600,000 drivers working for them on a particular day, right? Now, I mentioned when I started talking about Amazon that the numbers get big, right? And that the time to make decisions gets smaller and smaller. This is another great opportunity for our community, the optimization logistics community, to start really thinking differently about how we might think about even addressing these problems, right? When you get these numbers, you need to work hard. So they have what they call themselves the Meituan super brain. and I'll let you see what kind of techniques they use. Parallel computing, that's not a big surprise. Machine learning, data mining, prediction, lots and lots of things. The biggest thing I think that is helping them is how they select for each restaurant the acceptable delivery locations. Right? One way to scale down your problem is to say, well, I only deliver to the person that lives right next to the restaurant. Of course, you don't make money doing that, but that makes the logistics problem quite easy, right? And so this is a big thing, thinking about the service area for particular restaurants, right? And even that is not a simple problem to answer. Right? And that again depends on your dispatching, the delivery capacity that you have. There's really phenomenally interesting problems here. But scale, to me, is certainly an interesting one. Not only in meal delivery, we see that also just problems with UPS, right? More and more packages are going to be delivered. Problems get bigger and bigger. We have less and less time to make decisions. How do we deal with that? And that requires some creative new thinking. All right, and that's it for today. I am happy to answer questions if you have them. Yes?
I didn't see anything about forward-deployed kitchens specifically for GrubHub or somebody like that. Position is set up for nothing underneath.
This is a valid comment and a valid point you're making. We worked primarily with GrubHub on the transportation side. We are transportation experts. But I think it's a very legitimate question to say, hey, this ready time, right, is impacting the time you have to make the delivery. So focusing some of your attention and effort into streamlining maybe the meal production would be a very valid and useful thing to do. It is something that was never mentioned by GrubHub as something that they wanted our help with, but I fully agree with you that that's part of the answer possibly to the big picture question. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes?
You mentioned a second about the service areas and companies losing money. Just what are your thoughts on the viability of these last mile services from a profitability standpoint? Do we have to get to autonomous delivery? Do we have to get even more scale? Because as you look at Uber and Lyft and all those, it seems like they're making a lot of money, but they're spending an awful lot more. So how do you get to that profitability?
So I think this is a more general question that somehow society has to think about more, right? The value of all these companies is really determined by the stock market, not by their actual business, right? Uber, even Amazon is not making money. They're only making money on their computer server business, not in this package delivery part. They're losing money there. And so it's an interesting question, right? I mean, part of it comes back to what I said very early on. We, as customers, are not willing to pay for this service, right? And in a way, if you think about it, what we're asking for, and again, this is partly the fault of the companies themselves, what they're offering to us, instant delivery, is costly. The less time you have to make deliveries, the more costly it is for you. I mean, it's a simple logistics concept. So I think at the moment, so one way, of course, that you can try to do this is by exploiting crowd shipping, where you don't pay for benefits and at least your cost base is smaller. But even then, it's probably not yet small enough to recover the cost. I don't know, it's something that people have to think about. I mean, certainly autonomous delivery might be getting there, which is why I think at least the package delivery companies are looking at these kind of mobile parcel boxes as the future. And I think we need to, again, try and think creatively if we can actually make it profitable. Yes?
We're thinking about the gig economy and kind of new use cases for meal delivery, and that 35 to 40% like non-acceptance rate of orders kind of was a new information to me. From what you guys have seen so far, do you think that a driver is more likely to accept an order when they get one of those bundles, where it's maybe one pick but multiple drops? Does that influence it?
It is more likely because that also, so I mentioned that the predictors that we found to be the most helpful are tip amounts and, just previous behavior. I think another, I do think here, and I'm making a broad statement here, is that the other thing that really is shown here is that we need to integrate our optimization with more human behavior modeling, right? That is not something that we have done in the past. And I don't necessarily think that machine learning can figure it all out by itself. So talking with psychologists and thinking about it is going to be quite important. The other thing which, of course, is hard to understand just from, let's say, GrubHub data, if a person doesn't accept an order, doesn't mean that it wasn't somehow an okay order for the person. But if Uber offered him something better at the same time, he may just have chosen the Uber order, right? And I at the moment, as far as I know, they're not tracking or cannot track that information. So this makes it very hard to understand exactly what is happening. Is it the order, the task that we offer, or are there other things at play? The one thing that I do know, and you see this at Uber as well, this is why they start creating compensation scheme that discourage you from not accepting orders, right? I think Uber now has something where you get kind of a bonus if you do a certain number of trips during the month or during a week, right? And the main reason for doing that is to say, hey, if we offer you something, if you want to reach the bonus, you might as well better accept it, right? And it's very hard for an individual to see, let's say, at the beginning of the month, what should I do? Right? They have this target. Now you have to start thinking, once they reach the target, have you set it wrong? Do you need to start putting in extra compensation schemes? There are lots of questions around this particular aspect, and some of them are not easy to answer because only now people start trying to really investigate the impact of people working for several of these platforms at the same time. Yes.
Making the orders more predictable in the sense that the pricing around when you are placing orders. Then you go a little away from the instant delivery, of course, but like I can imagine that there are people which are being fine with ordering around lunchtime for their dinner.
Yes. And this, yes. So this is what you have seen a little bit with Uber Pool, right? Uber Pool didn't work very well at the start. And again, if you think about it, the reasons were fairly obvious, right? If people just say, I want to go from A to B now, and they expect the vehicle to show up within 3-4 minutes, the chance that you can also reroute it to find somebody exactly on the route to where you go are small, right? So the people at Uber Pool have started to think about different schemes, right, where you announce earlier to give them more time to find consolidation options. So that's an example of where exactly this is happening. You need to somehow incentivize, right? If Uber Pool is a good example, they said, well, it's going to be cheaper for you, and they didn't get anything in return, and then couldn't make it work. Right now they say it's going to be cheaper for you, but you have to tell us a bit earlier. And we will send you a message when the person is going to be at your door, etc. So clearly working on trying to get information earlier is very important. And we've done studies also for GrubHub to see what the impact would be if they knew 15 minutes earlier. And there is a big impact. How to make it happen is less clear. Yeah. All right, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.